Good morning or good afternoon, Year 9s. Just going to quickly go through the general instructions that you'll have noticed on all the other PowerPoints as well. So very quickly, obviously tasks are in yellow as always. Now work that is in blue is stuff you need to send to your teacher. So there wasn't really anything last week, but this week you must send the work that is on slide 10 and 20 so your teacher can check your understanding. Now, obviously, if you can hear me, that's great because that means that Narrated PowerPoint is working. Remember that obviously, if there's any issues, you can also go on YouTube. Just think about as well the idea of pausing the video to complete the work. So listen to me explain the task, pause it, complete it, and then if you then replay the video again, I'll then talk through the task and the answers. Obviously, we've got 2 hours worth of history work to do. This week, there are quite a lot of notes. Unfortunately, there was no way to avoid that. So you'll need to make sure that you're working as quickly as you can so it doesn't take you any more than the 2 hours. Now, lastly, if you are stuck, you can come and talk to me on Wednesday at 10. You can send me questions and I will verbally answer. Nobody can see what your questions are apart from me. And I will make sure that I'm answering those as best I can. Now, you only need to join that if you haven't understood the work or if you want clarification on anything. It's not worth joining once you've listened to this narrated PowerPoint if you don't have any questions, because I'm not going to go through the stuff because it's all done on this. So this is the main resource, but that is an option there if you need it and if you're stuck. Okay, so the first task I'd like you to complete is the Kaiser's Germany short answer test. Now, obviously, if we were in lesson, we would have done a formal short answer test at the end of the unit. So what I'd like you to do is to go on there and complete those 26 questions, and then you can move on to coming back to this work and looking at the new topic, which is Weimar Germany. So today we're going to be looking at the Weimar Constitution and looking at what their government looked like. Now, before we begin, I just want you to have a very quick think about what your ideal government and constitution would look like. Now, as you can see here, a constitution is the rules which say how a country should be governed. So I want you to imagine your own country. What would you want it to look like? So there's lots of questions here to prompt you of things that you might want to think about. You know, if you could choose, would you still have the royalty that we have, or would you not have a royal family anymore? Would you have somebody being a president, for example? You know, would you allow them to be re-elected? Let's say you've got a president which you've said they're allowed to be elected once or twice or whatever. Who should be allowed to vote at what age? Maybe how often you vote, and what kind of rights you would have as well. So you don't have to write anything down, but you can if you want to. But it might be worth having a conversation with your parents, maybe at dinner tonight, about what would they make their ideal government look like as well, just because it's quite an interesting discussion to have. So your title for the first part of today's lesson is How Different Was the New German Constitution? So remember, we're ideally doing this on lined paper so that we can put it in a folder when we come back, but if not, do it in an exercise book, hopefully your history one. So today we're going to be looking at describing the old and new constitution and thinking about how much had they changed. You know, was it really that different when they got rid of the Kaiser in November 1918? You know, did things change really drastically or not? So write down that title, please. Okay, so another very quick task today. What I'd like you to do is look at these 3 keywords that we've got on the left-hand side, and then there's 3 definitions on the right-hand side. Now, these are jumbled up at the moment, so they're not correct. Obviously, a monarch isn't about the rules. So what I'd like you to do is just to have a little think about which one goes with which. You don't need to write anything down just yet, but just pause the video now and have a little look at that. So here we've got the definitions matched up with the correct keyword. So what I'd like you to do is just pause the video and then write down those 3 words so that you know what we mean when we're talking about a constitution and a republic, because they're going to be words that we're using today. So just pause the video here. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is the birth of the Weimar Republic, this new government that comes in once they get rid of the Kaiser. And we've got a flow diagram on this slide here. And all I'd like you to do is just to make some notes on it and copy it down underneath the subheading of the birth of the Weimar Republic. So let's just talk through it before you start copying it down quickly. So this is stuff that we actually were introduced to last week when we looked at the abdication of the Kaiser. So we know by autumn 1918 that the Allies had clearly won the war, and certainly by September of 1918 they knew that they had lost and there was no way that they could come back from this. Now, just first of all, apologies because I put the wrong answer and I clicked on the wrong thing in the short answer test last week. So if you picked up on that, fantastic. It was September 1918 that the Germans had clearly lost by. Now, the Allies had offered peace to the Germans, but they said if they were going to get good peace terms and if they wanted to end the war, Germany needed to become more democratic. Because remember, before it was very autocratic under the Kaiser, where the Kaiser was really, really powerful. Now, the Kaiser refused to do that. He wanted to keep fighting. However, when the German people found out that their government had asked for peace, a lot of people thought that they didn't want to die at the end of the war when it seemed like war was going to be over very soon. This then led to all the mutinies that you made notes on, where it then triggered other revolts. Essentially, a revolution got started in Germany. We know as a result of that revolution that the Kaiser had to abdicate his throne, had to give up his throne, and he left Germany fearing for his life, and he went and lived in the Netherlands after. Now, the next day, the socialist leader, a man that we're going to be looking at, called Friedrich Ebert, became the new leader of the Republic of Germany, this new government where they got rid of their monarch and they are now democratic. And his first task as this new head of state was to draw up a constitution. He had to try and make sure that they were changing Germany from this autocratic government under the Kaiser to this new democratic government that lots of German people wanted. Now, crucially, and we'll come back to this later, he becomes the leader on the 9th of November 1918, and then he immediately signs an armistice with the Allies a couple of days later on the 11th of November 1918. That's what we celebrate when we do the poppies. It's the Armistice Day. So we're going to see he makes the government quite unpopular with his very first move. So pause the video here and copy down that flow diagram. All right, so let's have a little look at the German constitution, the new one versus the old under the Kaiser. So down the left-hand side here, you can see this old constitution, how it was run, you know, what the Reichstag was like. Remember, that's the German parliament, who the head of state was, and what kind of rights the German people had. Then we can see here on the right, we have got the new German constitution, now who's in charge, how powerful is the Reichstag, and again, what are the rights like of the German people. Now, all I want you to do is to pause the video in a second and have a little look at the differences here. And I want you to think about, do you think there's been an improvement? You know, for instance, here it talks about how the Kaiser is the leader of Germany. And here it talks about the role of the president. I want you to think about, do you think that's better that they have an elected president now rather than a Kaiser? I'd also like to look at things like the voting ages and who can vote, and have a little look and think about, you know, your thoughts on that. Do you think that things have improved in terms of the voting rights? Do you think that it's better that the Reichstag has more power now than it did? And do you think that the civil rights of Germans have improved? And you'll need to look at that a little bit there. Now, you don't have to write anything down, but just pause it and have a little think about whether there's been much improvement between this old constitution and this new one. Okay, so I'm going to talk you through some key points that we've seen on this old versus new constitution diagram. So really key things to look at here. Obviously, we can see before they had a Kaiser as the head of state, a king, who was somebody that got the position because their parent had had it, because their dad had ruled before them, they therefore were allowed to rule the country. Now they completely change it up, and this time instead they have a president. So this is somebody who is elected. In the case of Weimar government, it's every 7 years. Now they've put in place an age limit of saying you have to be 35 years or older. They think that that's about them having enough life experience to be able to rule the country effectively. So we can see great change with the fact that before it's about inheriting your position, now it's about kind of earning it and getting it through an election. However, there is something that's still quite similar in a way between the two ones. So here, The Kaiser, remember, could essentially make whatever laws he wanted, and he could get whatever laws he wanted passed. He could issue royal proclamations, essentially, and he could control basically the German government. In this case here, they have put in a new rule called Article 48 that we'll look at a little bit later. This allowed the president to rule without the Reichstag in times of an emergency. So even though the head of state has changed quite drastically, actually they can still pass some laws without the Reichstag if they really need to. So the key was in times of emergency. We've then got about the Reichstag, and we've seen that before it wasn't very powerful. Now it is much more powerful than before. We've seen that there's been some big changes with who can vote. Now, Germany allows all men and women aged 20 or over to vote from 1919. Now, it might not seem like that big a deal to you guys, where we know that men and women in this country can vote, but actually that was one of the most democratic and progressive states in Europe at that time. Even in Britain, where yes, they allowed women to vote from 1918, men could be 21, whereas women had to be 30. So there was still unfairness there. Whereas when we look here, it's actually equal, which is a really, really big deal. Now, the last area to look at is the civil liberties and the civil rights of the Germans. Before, under the Kaiser, people didn't have that much freedom. So, for instance, freedom of speech didn't exist in Germany before. You could be arrested for what you said, especially if you were criticising the Kaiser. Whereas things have changed quite a lot under this new constitution. They have extensive social rights, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, etc. So lots of different freedoms that they didn't have before. Now, all I'd like you to do with this information is to copy out the table if you don't have a printer. If you do have a printer, you can find this on Show My Homework and you can just print it and stick it in instead. So pause the video here to be able to do that. Okay, so we're going to do a consolidation task now to make sure that you've understood the key changes between the old German system and the new. So I'd like you to answer the question on your lined paper. Has there been much change between the constitution under the Kaiser and the new one? So you need to write a paragraph to explain your views and try and use examples from the constitutions that you've just copied down to be able to support your points. Now, if you're stuck, I have put a sentence starter here if you need it, but obviously you don't have to use that at all. And once you've done this piece of work, you need to send it to your teacher. This is going to help us check that you've understood some of the really key points about the old constitution and the new, and about how much change there has been. So pause the video here to do that question there, and then you can move on after. Now we're going to be moving on in a second to looking at the voting system that was used under the Weimar Republic. Before we do that, I just want you to think about what type of voting system we use in England. Do you know anything about who you vote for, how the voting system works, who becomes our government? So I'm just going to pause for 30 seconds or so for you to think about what you know about our government. Okay, so we're just going to have a quick talk about what our voting system looks like in the UK, so we can then understand that there are different voting systems and you can compare it to the German system that was used in the Weimar Republic. Now, we use a system called first past the post, and this is something that is used across lots of different countries, and there are definite strengths to it, but as always with all different voting systems, there are also flaws with it as well. So this system, the way it works is you vote locally, not necessarily for the party that you want, but you vote for who you want to be your local MP. The party that gets the most MPs and wins the most seats in different constituencies then becomes the party that is in charge. So you can see here on this map, this is from 2019 general election. You can see that every area that is shaded blue, so for instance, let's just pick out one little constituency there, every area that is blue is a Conservative MP that is running that little local area and representing them. So every area that is red, that is a Labour Party constituency. That's where the Labour Party have won. Now, this system is great in lots of ways. However, there is a flaw with it. And the flaw is that a lot of people think, well, my vote doesn't count. In this general election, there was a voter turnout of 63%. So that means that less than 2/3 of adults that are that are eligible to vote, only 2/3 of them turned up. And that's because some people say and argue, well, my voting is pointless. So let's say you're a Labour supporter, but you live in an area that's very conservative. It might have stayed conservative for over 100 years. Let's say all of your neighbours and all the local people around you, the majority of them support the Conservatives. Well, if you're a Labour supporter, some people say, well, actually, there's no point in voting because the Labour Party will never win in my area. So although this system has definitely got lots of strengths, there are criticisms that it's very difficult for a new political party to come in and win that seat. So definite strengths of the system, but you don't need to write anything down about that. I just wanted you to have a little look at it so that you can compare it to the German one. So I'm going to talk over the next few slides about how the German system works. You won't need to pause it unless you wanted to rewatch certain bits of it, and you won't need to make any notes until I tell you to. So just listen carefully as we talk through the stuff about how the German system works. So the German voting system that was used between 1919 and 1933 is very different to our first past the post that we have. Now, previously we mentioned the criticism that a lot of people think, well, my vote doesn't count, so what's the point in voting? The German system, called proportional representation, is where the percentage of votes equals the percentage of seats they get in the Reichstag, in the German parliament. So let's say Party A gets 10% of the votes, then they get 10% of the seats in the Reichstag. Essentially, 10% of the MPs that vote on different laws belong to their party. Party B gets 40% of the vote, so they get 40% of the seats in the Reichstag, and so on. Now, the idea behind this is that it's a really fair system where the government of Germany reflects what the views are of the German public. So there's some definite strengths to this. It's a very, very democratic system, but we're going to see that there are some flaws. So proportional representation, percentage of votes equal the percentage of seats in the Reichstag. Now, we've said that it's a very fair system, and in lots of ways it's great. However, there is a big problem with this. And the problem is that with proportional representation, the chance of winning a majority of the seats is very small. Now, what we mean by a majority or an overall majority is where you get just more than 50% of the seats. Now, the reason that you need more than 50% of the seats in an ideal world is because if you're going to pass a law, you'll vote on it. And you need to make sure that it gets passed by getting more than 50% of people supporting it. So if we take those same numbers from the previous slide and we look at where Party A has 10%, Party B has 40%, Party C gets 30% of the vote, and Party D gets 20% of the vote, we can see that there's going to be a problem here because it's going to be very difficult to pass a law where you need more than 50% of people agreeing and saying, yes, we support that law, if no party has more than 50% themselves. So I'd like you to have a little think about that problem of trying to get more than 50% of the vote and just pause for a second and think, how would you overcome that problem? What do you reckon these different parties can do to try and get just over 50% of the vote and therefore be able to pass laws? So you might have already thought about the idea of a coalition. Now, what we talk about when we're talking about a coalition is when two different political parties come together and decide that they're going to work together to try and control the government and get laws passed. So for instance, Party B, that has 40% of the votes, could join with Party D, who has 20% of the votes. And therefore, if they agree to work together, they can get laws passed. So for instance, when Party B has some issue that they really care about, let's say funding for social welfare, if Party D agrees with them, then they can help them get that law passed. And in return, when there's an issue that Party D really cares about, they can count on the support of Party B. Now, that is a really good thing if they can agree. You've got to remember that they're in different political parties for a reason. Clearly, their views differ on certain issues. Otherwise, they'd just be one political party. So it's really good for coalitions if they can form and work effectively together. But obviously, that relies on them agreeing. So we mentioned that coalitions can help if they can agree. But I also want to just talk to you a little bit about what the Weimar coalitions looked like. Now, before we saw two different parties joining together. We saw Party B, who had 40% of the vote, joining with Party D. Now, that doesn't always work out that way, where two political parties can join together. So sometimes they would have to have 3 or more parties that would be joining together in a coalition. In the Weimar years, so we're talking here about 1919 to 1933, there was never a government that didn't have a coalition of at least 3 different political parties joining together. Sometimes they had up to 5 different political parties joining together so they could get laws passed. Now, this is a real problem because it's hard enough getting 2 parties to agree. To get 3 parties to agree is really, really tough. And what it led to in Weimar is sometimes problems where they just couldn't get laws passed. And that means that people look at democracy, which is new to them. Remember, the Germans hadn't had democracy before. And they look at it and some people think, well, it's really weak. They can't even do their job of passing laws. So coalitions can be a great solution to the problem of proportional representation, but it does rely on people working together, and that wasn't necessarily the case in the Weimar government. Now we come to the bit that I'd like you to make notes on. So I'd like you to put a new subheading of Germany's voting system, proportional representation. And then I'd like you to read through this information here and make some notes on what proportional representation is. So make sure that you've got something down about the percentage of votes equals the percentage of seats in the Reichstag, and then give an example. And then I'd like you to also think about the advantages and the disadvantages of this voting system. Remember, no system is perfect. First past the post that we use has definitely got some advantages, but also got disadvantages too. So read through these notes, make sure you understand them, and then make notes on the definition and then the advantages and disadvantages. So if you just pause this now. So you've seen now some of the strengths and weaknesses of proportional representation. What we need to do now is look at generally the main weaknesses of the new constitution. Now, the Weimar government is formed in 1919, and the Weimar Republic lasts technically until Hitler comes to power, and he then destroys the system from within, and he becomes dictator by 1934. Now, some historians say that the Weimar government's constitution made it very difficult for it to deal with its problems and led to it eventually being overthrown by Hitler. So we need to know what the main 4 weaknesses were of the new constitution and how this caused problems for them later on. So you could do this as a spider diagram. If you're going to do it as a spider diagram, you'll need at least half a page. If you've got large handwriting, take a full page and make notes on these 4 main problems that we're going to talk through. So the first main weakness of the new constitution was the fact that it was born out of Germany's defeat in the war and was never likely to be accepted by all Germans. It was the Allies that had insisted that Germany becomes more democratic, not the German people. So even though some people were happy to see the back of the Kaiser, actually the majority of people weren't looking for a more democratic government. Some of them wanted new leadership, but they might have wanted a figure like the Kaiser rather than having this new democracy that they then had. Remember as well that their very first action on the 11th of November 1918 was to sign the armistice which ended the war. And propaganda before that had said that Germans were winning the war for so long that there was a lot of anger and resentment that this new government comes in, this democratic government, and they're weak and they don't carry on with the war and then they end it straight away. So there was lots of claims that they'd stabbed the army in the back by doing this, which you might remember from Conflict and Tension. Another main weakness, very similar to that last one, is that it is built on really shaky foundations. For a government to be successful, it's going to be very difficult if, when it's created out of the impact of World War I, which has devastated Germany. So right from the beginning, Ebert faces constant challenges. You're going to look a little bit later on in this lesson about when the left wing, a group called the Spartacists or the Communists, tried to rise up and get rid of this new democratic government straight away. And that's not even the only time. There are 3 major rebellions where people almost succeed in a way of toppling the government. We've also mentioned about proportional representation already, but briefly mention here about the fact that they could never really get an overall majority, and that caused problems obviously with getting laws passed. But also, it also is negative because it makes people think that democracy is weak. And the final weakness of the new constitution is something I mentioned earlier on when you were looking at the old versus new constitution, and that is something called Article 48. So the president was given emergency powers where he was supposed to use the Reichstag to get laws passed. But if he really, really needed to, he could suspend the government and avoid democracy and get laws passed really quickly by passing them using this Article 48. However, we're going to see that that gets abused later on. I mean, Ebert, the first president of the Weimar Republic, uses Article 48 136 times in the first 5 years. So it's something that absolutely can get abused, and later on it's going to be used quite badly. I'm going to study that after we come back in September. So as I said, pause this video here now and make notes on those 4 different weaknesses of the new constitution. What we've got here is your second consolidation task where we're checking your understanding of what you've been looking at and what you've made notes on. So what I'd like you to do is thinking about everything that you've done in this last hour. I'd like to think about, do you think the Weimar Constitution was an improvement on the old system under the Kaiser? So you've got to explain why and use examples of what has or hasn't improved. Now you might want to do this as 3 paragraphs. If you did, you could do 1 paragraph about what you think's improved, 1 paragraph about what you think hasn't improved, and then you could do a conclusion. Or you could do it as 1 larger paragraph where you consider those things within it. So I want you to think about, what do you think in your opinion, and remember this is just your opinion, there's no right or wrong here, what do you think in your opinion, has it improved very much, and why or why not? And once you've done this, you need to send this to your teacher. This is your next task that needs to be submitted on Show My Homework or emailed if you can't submit it there for some reason. Okay, so you've now finished that first hour of work. I'm aware it might have taken you slightly longer than an hour. So we are going to do a second lesson, but this one is going to be shorter, so don't worry, it won't take as long as the last one. So could you please put this new title at the top of another piece of lined paper? How popular was the Weimar government with the left wing? So just pause that now to be able to do that. So just as an introduction, I want you to look at people who disliked the new Weimar government. Now we mentioned already that actually it was very unpopular with a lot of people because of its first action of, signing the armistice, and because a lot of people thought that democracy was a weak system that they didn't really want. What we've got to remember is that the success of the government depends on the German people accepting almost instant change from a traditional autocratic German system of government to this new democratic version. It was always going to be very difficult when you change your political system that drastically. It's always going to cause problems. Now, it's hated by lots of people on both the left and the right wing, and we'll talk more about what we mean by that next week. So it was hated by many right-wing people. So remember that Hitler is an example of a very extreme right-wing person. So lots of people that had supported the Kaiser, and remember the Kaiser was right-wing, lots of people that supported him didn't like this new government for various reasons. And these are powerful people. Some of these people are at the top of the army command. Some of these people are at the top of the civil service, doing admin and kind of running the government. And lots of them want a return of the Kaiser, Wilhelm II, to come back, or to have another figure like him. So it's already difficult for this new Weimar government to be successful when actually lots of right-wing people don't like this new democracy. And actually the majority of the people that are in these top positions of government are actually right-wing. But we're going to see as well today that there were actually lots of left-wing people that didn't like this new government as well. Some of them were quite extreme left-wing people called the communists, and they want to have a revolution like what Russia had experienced in 1917. So there are lots of people on both the left and the right, especially the extreme left and the extreme right, that don't like this new government. And we're going to look at a communist revolution in a second. So could you please put some notes down in your books about those 3 bullet points there? Just pause it here. So in a second, you're going to be studying something called the Spartacist Uprising, which happens in January 1919. Now, the Spartacist Uprising is when a group of communists tried to take over the government and tried to basically start a communist revolution like what happened in Russia in 1917. So I've put here a quick definition, in case you need it, of what we mean by the word communism and by somebody that's a communist. And essentially it's people that believe in equality and in wealth being distributed fairly. So no matter what your job is, let's say you're a family of 4, you would get the same as another family of 4. So it doesn't matter if your parents are both doctors or they're both waitresses or waiters. The idea is that you need the same because you're both families of 4 and therefore you should get the same. So communists very simply believe in equality and about the fact that eventually, power should be shared. There shouldn't be some elite people that are very rich. It should be much fairer than that. So you might be wondering, why do we call it the Spartacist Uprising and not the Communist Uprising if they're communists that are revolting against the government? And the reason that they call themselves the Spartacists is because they've named themselves after a Roman gladiator who led a revolt of slaves against the masters of ancient Rome. So they've just named themselves after a very famous figure, and we talk about them being the Spartacists. But in terms of their beliefs, they're communists. So you don't need to write anything down. On the next slide is where you're going to get your notes. Okay, so this is the really key bit of this second hour of lesson. So we're going to look at the Spartacist Uprising, also known as the Spartacist Revolt. Means the same, so it doesn't matter which one we use. Now, the Weimar government that we know is created officially in 1919 experiences some really tough years at the beginning. The period between 1919 and 1923 is called the crisis years because this new government has to deal with 3 major political uprisings. It also has to deal with loads of economic problems. It has to deal with being invaded by the French. So they face lots of different problems in this time. And the first one that we look at is the Spartacist Revolt, which happens in January 1919. Now, what I'd like you to do is to copy out this fact file in your books or on your lined paper. If you have a printer, I have put it on Show My Homework where you can then print it to save a bit of time. But don't worry if you don't have a printer. Let's talk through the information that you're then going to make notes on after. So we can see that this happened in January 1919, only a couple of months after the Kaiser has been forced off his throne. And it happened right in the centre of Germany in Berlin. So obviously the capital city, a really key area, lots of political activity going on in that area. So who is carrying out this rebellion? It's the group that we just mentioned before, the Spartacists, who are a group of communists that have named themselves after an old Roman gladiator that fought for freedom. And their leaders are fantastic, charismatic leaders. So we can see here that this guy here is called Karl Liebknecht, and then we also have another leader called Rosa Luxemburg. Very charismatic leaders, really important for the communist cause. So what was this about? It was an attempted takeover of the German government. They wanted to overthrow it, get rid of democracy and replace it with a communist system. And the reason that they wanted to do this is because they didn't think this new government, who was led by the Socialist Party, which is a moderate left-wing party, they didn't think the changes they were introducing went far enough. They wanted to help the people more. They thought that they wanted this system of equality that is communism. So let's have a little look at what happened then. Now there's 50,000 Smartists led by these leaders, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, who go on strike in the centre of Berlin. And they essentially want Germany to be ruled by workers' councils, where essentially people have more control over local government than they do currently. They were joined by some rebel soldiers and sailors, and they set up these councils all over Germany. Now, Ebert, the president of the Weimar Republic, is in a difficult position because there are 50,000 of these people that are rebelling and causing problems. So he gets a group of right-wing people called the Freikorps, who are ex-soldiers, to put down the revolt and try and fight them. And we've got to remember that these Freikorps are people that have just been fighting in the First World War. They're highly trained, they've got weapons, they're organised, and they're fighting against these group of workers, some of which have never fought before. So they actually find it very easy to be able to put this down. The actual revolt only lasts about 3 days. So they've got about 3 days of this brutal fighting that starts out. And eventually the Freikorps win and they kill over 100 of these workers that have taken part in this uprising. Now, not only do they kill some of the ordinary people that were part of this, but they actually murder the leaders of this political party. They murder Liebknecht and Luxemburg, and quite wrongly, because they arrest them, and it's after they're arrested that they then execute them and throw their bodies in a river. So quite a horrible event, very, very sad, obviously, that we've got 100 people killed in this. And it's really sad to think about the fact that this is in Germany, after the loss of 2 million people in the First World War. Now we've got some Germans killing other Germans for control of the country. So pause it here and make some notes on the different events and what happened. If you're struggling to read it on here, don't forget you can go and show my homework and download the document as well. So pause it here to be able to do that. So the final task for note making then is thinking about how it caused problems for the government. Now, knowing the key details in an event, knowing the who, what, where, when, why, all of those details are really important to be able to get a grade 4 or 5 at GCSE. But to be able to get the top grades, we need to be able to explain the impact of events. And in this case, we want to think about how did it cause problems for the government. So I need you to put this as a new subheading if you've been doing an online paper, and then make notes on these points here. If you had printed the sheet from the last slide, then what you need to do is make these notes in that bottom bit of the box where you've got the space to be able to do so. So let's talk through how it caused problems for the Weimar government then. Now, first of all, we mentioned that this is a communist revolution. There were lots of people that were middle and upper class that were really worried about this event. If you are wealthier, then communism tends, not always, but tends to be less appealing for you, because if a communist state was set up, you would lose your wealth and that would be distributed to people that need it as well. So a lot of people were then very worried that Germany was going to end up like communist Russia, and essentially lots of people started voting for right-wing parties, especially by the time we get to the late 1920s, early 1930s. They're voting for parties like the Nazis eventually because they're scared of the communists. It also creates a lot of business between the government and the communists, because obviously we've just mentioned about the fact that 100 communists have been killed, including, quite unnecessarily and quite illegally, the 2 leaders of the uprising as well. Now, they'd have definitely gone to prison for their actions because they're committing treason, but a lot of communists thought that was really out of order, that they were so brutally murdered when it was unnecessary. And it's not like the communists just went away. That was the main time that they tried to overthrow the government, and certainly it was their most successful one, but actually they do carry on trying to take over the government. So for instance, only a month later after the Spartacist uprising, they try and take over in Bavaria, which is a state in the south of Germany, where places like Munich are. Obviously that fails, and then they again try and take over an area called the Ruhr, which is like the industrial heartland of Germany, try and take that over in 1920. Now obviously they fail in those attempts, but they still carry on trying to get rid of the government as best they can. It's more difficult now without the great leadership of those two key individuals that we mentioned before. And the final problem is something that's going to be linked to what you study next week. And that is that by asking the Freikorps, these ex-soldiers, to help them crush this rebellion, it then made the Freikorps realise, remember the Freikorps don't like the government, they then realised, hang on a minute, the government's really weak and we're quite powerful. And eventually in 1920, they start their own rebellion called the Kapp Putsch. The word putsch just means revolt. So we're going to see that it actually causes a future right-wing rebellion as a result of them crushing this left-wing one. So pause the video here and make some notes on those points there. So this slide here is optional. What I've got here is what we would have played if we were in lesson. So all I'd like you to do is to turn your sheet over so you can't see your notes and just have a go and see, can you answer many of these questions about the Spartacist uprising? You don't have to write any of these answers down. It's just to have a quick check and see if you can remember the key details. Now, just so you know, the questions that are in yellow are the easy questions. The questions in green are slightly harder, and the questions in blue are the hardest ones. So see what you can answer, but don't feel like you need to write anything down. Okay, well done. You've completed all of the work for this week, which is excellent. Just make sure that you've done that Kaiser short answer test, which was on the first or second slide of this PowerPoint, and make sure that you've got at least 70% in terms of the score. If you haven't got more than 70%, it's a good idea to redo it and try and have another go after you've read through your flashcards for a second time. Okay, well done.